Welcome to the MuseCast, where we squeeze every last drop of inspiration out of Sunday's sermon.
Fingers up. I would say thumbs up, but it's fingers up, Dan, which means it's time for the MuseCast. Welcome to the MuseCast, everyone. Happy Tuesday. In Minnesota, just so you know, because I know you guys always like a good weather report. In Minnesota, we're in that beautiful time of fall when in the morning you think you might need, snow boots and the full garb, the full regalia. And by mid-morning, you're like, oh, it's a nice spring day. And then by the afternoon, you're like, oh, I'm going to put on my swimming suit and go to the beach because it's so stinking hot. So that's where we are in our little neck of the woods. Do you like this particular start to the fall season, Dan?
Yeah, normally I really do. This year it's been tough though because I got COVID, and I feel like before I got COVID it was summer, and then now as I'm feeling better, it's like a different season. Like I missed something. I missed the transition. So I was only sick for 8-10 days, but it feels like I was sick for a month because everything is so different out there than before I went under. So, but normally, yeah, I do like.
No doubt.
Yeah.
And seriously, like those leaves, once they start turning, like you go outside and be like, oh, was I asleep for a couple of months? Because it's a rapid change. Hey, in case you guys don't know, that's Dan Kent and I'm Shawna Boren. And look, Dan, would you say you're fully recovered, or are you still feeling a little?
I feel
laggy?
great. It's just that I do have a cough every once in a while because my throat tickles. But it's not like a sick tickle. It's more like it's like when you cough a lot and then you scratch your throat, and
yes.
So that's I still have that, but I feel great and doing cartwheels and doing yard work and all of that. So
we need to see that. This is still that time of year when okay, my kids go to school. Of course, they come home with all the things, all the colds and stuff. And so Sunday, getting ready for service in our pre-service meeting, I had a cough, but it was just because my throat was dry. And so one of our dear cameramen gave me a throat lozenge because he has cough drops on him all the time, and it's really sweet. So I was like, oh, thank you. And so someone saw me take it, and they were like, are you sick? And I'm like, no.
Yeah.
My throat is just dry. Trust me, I wouldn't be here if I were sick because I'm not about spreading stuff. So speaking of this Sunday, we have had a whirlwind couple of weeks, Dan. So let me just take you back. You got COVID. That's how this all started. COVID. We had our 30th anniversary celebration, and that was such a fun time.
I'm still buzzing.
Dan was not able to.
Still buzzing from that.
I know. It was such a fun time. Great. We got to hear. It was really cool because we got to hear from Greg, and we talked about this a little bit last week. We got to hear from Greg just some of the history and the stories that make us who we are, who we have been over the last 30 years. And it was really cool just to sit in remembrance of like, wow, all the ways in which God has been so active and showed up in our church body. And we heard a lot from Greg about Janice Rowling, our executive pastor. And if you don't know Woodland, and if you don't know our leadership structure, you may, after hearing that, think, wow, this Janice lady, calls all the shots. And, but the deal is first of all, yes, Janice is very gifted in what she does, and we are so thankful. But we do have a unique leadership structure, Dan. And you know this, you're a part of it. We have this, what we call the executive team, and Greg and Janice are on that team along with Paul Eddy. And we have elders and we have trustees. During that time, like when Greg was talking about all that history, there was also a steering committee. So there were a lot of voices involved in guiding the direction of the way things were going. And I'm thankful, honestly, that we are a part of an organization that does have that plurality of leadership where they each get to utilize their gifts and no one is like stepping into a lane that they're not wired to do so. And we get to, as pastors, we get to work with these guys quite a bit. And it's a real blessing, isn't it, Dan?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think, Greg we hear about Paul Eddy a lot, and we hear, about Mary. Mary's kind of, she's basically the director every weekend, and so she's sort of in charge of everything on the weekend, and so we hear about Mary, and it's funny because Greg just suddenly starts talking about Janice, and I think that's because we don't talk about Janice enough, and so Greg talked a lot about Janice, which gave the impression that we have some CEO who just calls all the shots, and that's Janice, but that's not the case. Janice is part of a very key, important part of a whole team of leadership, and it's been pretty great to be under this leadership team, just because there's what I appreciate is just how there's just the way it has gone, and there's no guarantees about this. You can't structure this. It really depends on the people who are on the team, but it's really easy, especially with a church the size of Woodland Hills. It's really easy for egos to grow, and for people to kind of get have issues with power, and but this leadership team has done such a great job of holding each other accountable and working together on some of the problems that the church faces and some of the challenges that we've faced, and Janice is definitely a key part of that, but she's just a part of it, and so it's been a great learning experience just to watch over the years from the outside. Cool. It's a cool structure.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's been a blessing to be a part of it. And so this last weekend we got to hear from Jim Beilby, and Jim Beilby does have a connection to our executive team in that he is, well, him, and he's also a professor at Bethel, which means he works alongside our very own Paul Eddy, and they've had a great friendship and working relationship for many, many, many years. And so we transitioned from our 30-year celebration into hearing from Jim Beilby, who is a professor at Bethel, who is tied to Paul Eddy as well. And we got to hear an encouraging, evangelistic message from Jim. And Dan, that leads us to today. This lovely MuseCast, but more importantly, that leads us to your summary.
Well, Jim, he was actually part of, we had a discipleship team here in the early 2000s, and it was Jim Beilby, Paul Eddy, Sandra Unger, myself, and I think Greg. I think those are the people who were on the team. And we read through Dallas Willard's The Divine Conspiracy, which just blew my mind 20 years ago. So he's been a part of the church at various levels over the years as well. I also used to play basketball with him. We used to do noon ball, and all these professors would play, and I was an adjunct at the time. Yeah. And he's a mean basketball player. I will say he is not very Jesus-like on the basketball court. Let me just say that he's you might get an elbow here and there when you're playing on the court against him, but he's a good player. And also, can you believe the gig he's got where he gets to go to the Timberwolves games?
I know.
And I think he sits
kidding me?
Right? I think he sits courtside, and he sends the updates to, I think, NBA.com or something like that. So when people are watching online,
NBA.com, and AP. Yeah, when I was introducing him, Dan, I'm not going to lie to you. I was thinking, this dude is going to be courtside when my Lakers come to town. He's going to he's going to see LeBron and whoever else is playing for the Timberwolves. But anyway, it's how lucky is that guy? Yeah. Oh my word.
Yeah, and he's also really smart. So he's got the Timberwolves gig. He's really smart. He's a good basketball player. He's a good Frisbee golf player. I mean, the guy's got everything, and he got to share, overflow his gifts for our congregation this weekend. And he was talking about what is the destiny of the unevangelized is sort of the question. And it's a very kind of like a common like theological talker is what it is, where people kind of talk about this. And just before I talk about what he says, I want to give a little background to it, because people can come at this question from a lot of different perspectives. Like why are we even asking this question? Like, what is the destiny of the unevangelized? What does that even mean? Well, what it means is that there's this idea that in order to be saved, in order to be in heaven, you have to hear the gospel and you have to respond positively to it. And there's a lot of passages that talk about this, and sort of one of the kind of popular ones is, I think, John 14:6, I think, or 14:10, no, 14:6, where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me. And so there's this idea that you have to respond to Jesus in order to have any chance of being with God in the afterlife. And so and we take that seriously, this idea that it's important that you understand Jesus in order to be compatible, in order to work in the afterlife. You have to understand what's going on with Jesus. That's sort of part of a core of what Christianity is about. And so this raises the question, well, what happens to those who never get a chance to hear about Jesus, who never, know anything about Jesus? Or if they do hear about Jesus, they hear some warped, skewed sort of concept of Jesus that's nothing like Jesus actually is. And so it's not fair to them that they never got a chance to respond, and so they can't be with God in the afterlife. So it doesn't seem like that's a very loving God to allow for this situation to occur. And so what Jim talked about is he talked about some solutions that don't really work in this, but then he proposed this idea that people who are not given an opportunity here will be given an opportunity after death to encounter Jesus and to respond either positively or negatively. In other words, after death, so post-mortem, you will get a chance to hear the good news and respond. So it's called post-mortem, I think post-mortem evangelism or post-mortem opportunity, I've heard. And so that's sort of what it's called. And then Jim gives a couple really good kind of like reasons to think that this is biblically justified, this perspective. And he talks about first of all, that God has a heart for the lost sheep. And so he talks about the lost sheep parable, where the good shepherd will leave the 99 sheep to go find that one sheep who has been lost, and he will go and search for that sheep until he finds the sheep and brings the sheep back. And so this just reveals the heart of the God that we worship. And then you also have these really kind of interesting verses in First Peter, where First Peter 3:19 and 20, it says that Jesus went down into Hades, basically, to preach to the prisoners, or to preach to those who before Jesus, who didn't have an opportunity. He preaches the good news to them. These are people who have been gone from earth for a long time, from the days of Noah, and he shares the good news with them. And it's a very obscure verse, and so you don't want to build a whole theology on that one verse, but it shows this hint, this hope that it seems like God's heart is very creative, and God will go through whatever God has to go through in order to get people to hear the good news and to give them an opportunity to respond. And really, that's sort of I think what the motivation for these types of discussions and these types of intellectual pursuits are, is that what type of God are we seeking after? What type of God are we worshiping? And so this whole kind of theory of postmortem opportunity or postmortem evangelism really just shows us a God who cares and who loves and who gives people an opportunity no matter what, and a God who is fair and so forth. And then the last thing he talked about, which I thought was really interesting, was what are some of the implications of entertaining this idea of a post-death opportunity. And the big kind of concern that Jim addresses is that if we are given an opportunity to encounter Jesus after death, well, that's going to be a much better, more salient, more clear opportunity than anything that I can provide as an evangelist here on earth to other people. And so why not, just like, pack up my bags and go fishing? Why even spend effort, trying to evangelize when I may be keeping people from having a better opportunity to just encounter Jesus, where they can see Jesus himself. And what Jim argues is that, we are called to be a part of something that God is doing here, and that God is inviting us into this opportunity to be a part of this very important, crucial, meaningful mission. And it's sort of like this blessed opportunity that God is inviting us into. And so it would be equally foolish to kind of disregard that opportunity and to miss out on that. And he gives a good example, a good analogy of how his daughter helped him build their house. And I thought that was a cool story where the daughter didn't really like help, but she contributed, and it was very meaningful to her, and that made it meaningful to him. And so to for us, as we share the good news and to seek the lost sheep of the world, that's something that can fill our life with purpose and meaning. And it's just an opportunity that God gives us. So I think that's the gist of my sermon. What did you think of the sermon?
Thank you, Dan, for that summary. I was really touched, impacted by the foundation as to why he taught this sermon. And that was the letter that he shared to a girlfriend back in high school that he never gave to her when he found, I think he said when his football coach got cancer, he began to have some questions, and just the honesty of wrestling with that pretty big question of, we serve a loving God, and what about those who never get to hear about him or who lived before Jesus's time on earth? What about them? And then the three different examples that he provided, that just was, it really was, I thought, a good way to pose this discussion and to pose this question and to have this discussion. And I think it's important that we got to see someone who is a theologian, who does have a relationship with Jesus, but we got to see in real time kind of his journey with some of these harder questions about who God is and the nature of who God is. And so I always appreciate when we get to see vulnerability while we're learning things. It does lead me to think through the times in which I've had some pretty big questions. And I think it merits thinking through what he proposed. I think it merits just thinking through, again, what is your picture of God? Like, I like the way you put it, Dan, when you said, you talked about God's creativity. Like, there's a lot I don't know. There's a whole lot I don't know. But I do know that God is really creative, and I know that God is really loving. And in my heart, I just think I'm not about to limit that love nor that creativity. Because I just, if any being could find a way to make himself known to someone whose time frame doesn't quite match up with, hours or, their time here on earth, it's God. I mean, it is God. So I was appreciative to hear his thoughts on that. And I definitely felt like I was in a bit of a classroom lecture. Like the note taking was ferocious, 4 points, 3 points. So I was like trying to make sure I got it all down. There was just a lot there, a lot of rich things there for our discussion. But it does lead me to a question for you, Dan, that I think it would be great for us to bat around a little bit today. And like I said, he started this whole thing because he had a question, right? He wrote a letter. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about benefit, I'll call it that, of questioning things of our faith? Or do you think, oh, that's a slippery slope that we maybe don't want to go down?
Well, I think questioning faith is I think it's the foundation of good discipleship, is asking questions. And I believe that the Bible is written so that we ask questions. Just like one of my favorite words that I learned is enthymemic is a word. And enthymemic is when you have like two premises and you don't give the conclusion because the conclusion is just obvious based on the premises. And so hold on, I got a fruit fly in here. And so like, and you'll see this in the Bible a lot, where the Bible will say these things and there's this explicit implication there it's not articulated in words, but it's just obvious if you read it. But it requires you to think and to engage it personally. And I think even like the Genesis account, there's a lot of the creation story. There's a lot of stuff there that's like, well, that doesn't make any sense, and it's supposed to trigger like questions. And I just think you find that throughout the entire Old Testament. And the fact that we're told over 100 times in the Old Testament to seek the Lord, that's part of what seeking is asking questions. And and the fact that Israel itself is named after Jacob, who and God named Jacob Israel because it means literally to wrestle with God. I just think that questioning is a core part of that. But I will say that the spirit of questioning can be very different. And there are people who are cynical, and the nature of their questions is different than someone who is seeking the Lord. A cynical person will question in a mocking sort of way, as a way to expose the presumed falsehood of a belief system. And if a person is at that where they disagree with it, that's fine. But in that spirit, it's really hard to find objective answers because you're already presuming what the answer is going to be. But if you are earnest and you are open-hearted and open-minded, and you ask these questions and you wrestle with things, I think that the Bible and the Holy Spirit and the gift of reason that God has given us, I think that we can find incredible treasures. And I think it's my favorite part of discipleship is wrestling with some of these questions. And it sometimes it takes a lot of time. I mean, it's not like you can ask these questions and think about them for an afternoon and then come to all the answers. I mean, It's been really fun. It's been really fun watching Greg wrestle through some of these big questions. And I remember when he was working on Crucifixion of the Warrior God, I mean, he started wrestling with that in the early 2000s, and 14, 15 years later, he wrote this book, and so it can be a long journey, but it's a pretty amazing journey, and I think it's very important, and it's good for us to ask these questions, because every time we ask these questions, we learn a little bit more about God and maybe ourselves as well. So that's my answer. What do you think of that? How does that hit you?
I like it. I think so. When you were answering my question, I heard heart posture. I think that's so important. Like, how are we? Why are we questioning? What is the intent of our questions? And so, if it's from a place of cynicism, okay, it's not like God can't handle that. But at some point, it's like we need to move beyond just the cynicism. If your questions are really like, because you're seeking to understand the heart of God, and you're seeking to understand this faith that some have died for and that many of us, believe in, I think it's important and it's okay. Like, I think that's a part of getting to know one another. Could you imagine when you met Barbara, if you never asked her a question about herself, or never, wrestled with trying to discover who she was? I mean, right. Again, I'm always going to like put it on the bottom shelf and explain things very simplistically, but it's really no different. Like, we are striving to get to know this loving Father. Many of us haven't had great opportunity to do that with others in our life. Like, we haven't had loving relationships where we could question and wrestle and figure stuff out. And so maybe we project that upon God. But I just don't think that God is afraid of our questions. I don't think that he's offended. I think that it's healthy and good. And it's also, I think, an opportunity to engage with others, because sometimes you're going to have questions and you're not going to be able to come to a conclusion on own. The second thing I was hearing as you were answering the question was, again, journey. It is a journey. And I would hate to think that in my relationship with the Lord, I would hate to think that, like, I know it all right here and now on this day in October of 2022. There's just no way. I don't know it all. My hope is that I'm continually growing and learning. I'm getting some stuff wrong and I'm learning from that. And I'm getting some stuff right and I'm learning from that. And I'm learning from others. And God is revealing more and more of himself to me. Again, just like my relationship with my husband, with my children, it wasn't just a one and done. It's an ever evolving, ever growing, intimate relationship that we are just entwined in one another's lives. And that, to me, is a part of the process of getting to know the Lord. And I think it's a good thing. I'm all for it.
Amen.
Dan, what do you think when you heard Jim talking about these post-mortem opportunities? What was your initial reaction, let's just say? And followed by, if someone were to push back against that thought or that concept, what might be something you could say to maybe help them not necessarily adapt that thought process, but at least be open to the possibility of God working beyond our life here and now?
Yeah. I in terms of my initial reaction, I think I probably already held the position that Jim is espousing here. And for people who, they might not receive this, openly, they may not understand it, or they may just flat out reject it. I guess the line of questioning that I would recommend people to go down is to just ask, what is God's love like? And what does it mean that God loves? And, some of the potential issues are things like justice. Like, is it fair that like, I can imagine somebody who has maybe gone to church every Sunday for 40 years, and they have done daily devotionals, and they have done all of this stuff to pursue God and to develop their relationship with God. And then, some Yahoo who has lived their lives in just like, partying and not caring about anything about God, they get the same opportunity after death. It may, come off as, well, that's not very fair. And so I guess what I would just encourage people to do is to just think about, well, what does it mean that God loves everybody and desires that all shall be saved? The New Testament tells us. What does that mean, and what are the implications of that? And I think that it kind of forces you to consider something like what Jim is talking about. And then there's also the parable of the workers is another good example of just like how God's mercy and God's love is different than what we might expect, and that God's mercy and God's love sort of trumps fairness. It goes beyond fairness. In the parable of the workers, of course, is this idea that there's this vineyard owner who sees people standing around at 9 a.m. and says, "Hey, why don't you work in my vineyard, and I'll pay you, a denarius if you work." And then at noon, he sees more people standing out there, and he says, "Why don't you come on in here? I'll give you a denarius if you work my vineyard for the rest of the day." And then, like, an hour before the end of the day, he sees more people standing out there, and he says, "Why don't you come on in? and I'll give you a denarius if you work the rest of the day. And then at the end of the day, of course, he gives everybody a denarius, even though some of those people were there at 9 a.m. and they got paid exactly the same as the guy who showed up at the last minute. And but that's revealing what God's heart is like. And if that bothers us, the point of the parable is that that's a problem in us, and that's something that's a indicator light that there's something wrong with our own hearts. And that's something that we have to wrestle with. And so I think that's what I would say is I think so. Two parts of that. I think that the more I've reflected on it, the more I've come to believe that there's something like what Jim is talking about has to be right. And all of the resistance and all of the problems I've had with it tends to be a problem in me, not with the concept of God that these ideas sort of presume. So that's what I would say.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, that parallel, it makes me think of difference between looking at God as a loving father and looking at God as an HR director, right? A human resources director, where they got to make sure the pay scale is even, and someone who gets hired after this, it's just like, no, that's not who God is. He's a loving father. I think we could have a lot more discussion, but guess what, Dan? I was about to call you Jim. Guess what? Guess what, Dan? We are at that time and space in our MuseCast that we lovingly refer to as, what do you think?
Nugget time.
Nugget time. That's right, nugget time. And since you were ill, and since you have recovered and you've been doing cartwheels in your yard, I'm going to give you the choice of kicking off nugget time or concluding nugget time. So do you want to go first, or do you want to go
I will
last?
kick it off. I will kick it off. I don't really have a nugget. It's more of a teaser, because one of the things that struck me is, Jim talked about what is it called? Aslan is part of the Chronicles of Narnia. That's what it's called. And he talked about this scene in the last battle, I think, where all of the people of the world approach Aslan, and who is sort of the Jesus figure in the Chronicles of Narnia, and they see Aslan's face and they choose whether to go right or go left. And those who are disappointed or angered or what bothered by Jesus or Aslan, they disappear into Aslan's shadow. Whereas those who see Aslan and see the love of Aslan and see all the goodness in Aslan, they go the other way. And and it's sort of course, a big analogy of what it's going to be like when we see our Maker. Some of us will recognize the goodness and beauty and love of Jesus, and some people will not recognize that, and it sort of really reflects sort of the issues that we're talking about here. But it's not like there's nothing different in Aslan or in Jesus when the people see Aslan. The difference is within their own hearts and in their own minds and in their own spirits. And that's not something that just instantaneously happens. That's something that we develop over our entire life on day-to-day, moment-by-moment basis. And so the question is, what is it that that the person who sees the love of Aslan or Jesus and goes the correct direction versus those who don't see it, who see something that bothers them, that sees something that compels them to disappear? What choices did these people make throughout their life that brought them to that point? And I love this because it's a great setup for our next series, which is going to be in 3 weeks, and I'm going to be kicking it off at the end of October, and I'm going to be talking about what's called the two ways tradition, which is in the first century. You see it in intertestamental writing, the writing between the Old and the New Testament. You also see it in the Old Testament. You see it in Jesus. You see this definitely in Jesus's teaching, specifically at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. He talks about these two ways. And so, for instance, he talks about I need my glasses. He talks about true and false prophets. So there's these two ways. You could go to true prophets or false prophets, true and false disciples, wise and foolish builders. And there's just like these two ways. And it was this way of teaching principles in the first century. And you see it in the early church after the New Testament as well. They continue to pick up on this idea of these two ways. And it's really a way of looking at our day-to-day life and the decisions we make and how we interpret our experiences that I think can get us to that point where when we're faced with these two ways, we end up going the right way. And it's something that happens over the course of our life, and it can be an accumulative sort of thing. And so it's really a great setup for that series as we close the Sermon on the Mount and put a bow on this long series that we've been working on. So that's my nugget as a teaser for the next series based on what Jim was talking about.
Nice, Dan. I like how your nugget was about as long as the Sermon on the Mount series that we've been in. There was a lot of richness in that nugget. Thank you for sharing. I'm just going to say God's love is not birthday cake, right? Like, we don't have to like fight over our peace. And my encouragement for us all is to rest in the knowing of his love for you. And guess what? That there's enough for Dan, and there's enough for my neighbor, and there's enough for that person down the street, that person over there that I necessarily don't care for. Like, his love is abundant. It's not birthday cake. We don't have to fight over the pieces. And also ask God to reveal to you aspects of his creativity. Because like we've said throughout the MuseCast, he's creative. And I trust that in that creativity, he will go to any lengths out of his love for us. And we have the free will to respond favorably or to reject. So that's all for today, folks. We want to thank you for being here. Thank you for sending in questions. Remember, if you want to chat with us, 4 p.m. on YouTube. If you want to take us on your next walk or run, you can catch us via podcast, wherever you listen to your podcast. But don't forget to continue to tune in on Sundays and circle back with us on Tuesdays. And I know your appetites are now wet for this next series coming. So keep coming back, because it's going to be here before you know it. And Dan and I are going to continue that conversation. Have a great week, everyone.